Foreign succession is the next area that we will cover. In this particular situation, we've got Henry, who has died. He's a US resident, domiciled in the US, but a Chinese citizen, married to Lynn, and similar situation to previously, same set of facts. The questions we have here are, what is the basis of application of US succession law? Is it domicile, situs, nationality, or residence? Which succession law will apply to US company shares and land, the US or China, and whether US succession law contains forced heirship provisions. So, John.
Yeah, so state by state from a succession law perspective.
This is a question for John? Or?
Yeah, state by state from a succession law perspective. Don't confuse that with the estate tax issues that I mentioned earlier. There can be a federal definition of domicile. All US citizens are considered to be domiciled in the US regardless of their physical location. So like myself, a US citizen living in Singapore, if I pass away, I'm considered domiciled in the US for federal estate tax purposes, not necessarily for succession law purposes in a particular state. The US company shares and land, similar to what I mentioned before, we're looking at where they're located, movable versus immovable property, but we've added another element to the equation that's going to tip it towards a particular state, and that's the residence of Henry at the time that he passes. And then forced heirship, the US doesn't have forced heirship rules the way that we think of them outside the US. There's one state, Louisiana, that has a civil law background, not a common law background, but they, in the 80s, by statute, kind of eliminated the forced heirship elements of their law. We do have statutory protections, but those tend to focus in on spouses only, not children, another issue, the way that forced heirship rules outside the United States would work.
Right. Thanks, John. Another question, which succession law would apply to the Chinese property, US or China? And is it possible for forced heir rights to be asserted against the Chinese property?
If it's all right with Dr. Gong, I'll start and then he can pick up. I think most likely we're looking at the US law in this situation because we got that combination domicile, a lot of assets in the US, and so we're probably going to try to enforce those. But I think we could potentially run into a conflict of the domicile definition. As I said, the US has an exclusionary one. They really don't care about what anybody else's is, and under the US rules, you can't have multiple domiciles in that way. And so I suspect if Henry hasn't deregistered his household and his passport in China, that Dr. Gong may speak about how China law could potentially apply.
Okay, Dr. Gong?
Yeah, I think again, it's for movable assets, then the domicile law will apply, but for the real estate, then the PRC law will apply. So there will be, as John mentioned earlier, there could be contention, there could be conflict of both the PRC law and the US law in such kind of situations. So then we will have to look at the facts more closely and make a determination.
All right. Thank you, Frank. Another question, is it possible for Chinese forced heirship and clawback rights to be asserted against the Singapore Trust? And what anti-forced heirship protections does Singapore Trust law provide? And is it possible that Chinese forced heirship rights will be recognized and enforceable in Cayman? Zach?
Clawback, I think Dr. Gong will say that generally China forced heir clawback rights wouldn't be asserted outside of China, if I remember correctly, so that would be an unlikely claim. If it were to be forwarded, notwithstanding lack of precedent, then Singapore has anti-forced heirship protections under its trust law, so they would be defeated by those provisions. Obviously, you'd have to go through the detail of those, but broadly that's how it would work. And with respect to Cayman Islands, Cayman would look at what they view as the domicile of Henry at death, and they'd make a determination. And I think in the fact pattern here, Cayman would probably determine that Henry had died domiciled in the US, and therefore they wouldn't look to China law for effectively the essential validity of who's entitled to those shares. So they would look to the US law, so they wouldn't look to China.
Right. Thank you, Zach.